Right, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by ASPA's section on democracy and social justice, dismantling inequities and injustices in criminal justice, which is part 3 of DSJ's series on dismantling white supremacy. This event is being recorded, and after review by our panelists, it will be posted on our YouTube page. My name is Sean, and I serve as chair of the section, and I'm going to be remaining off camera for the duration of the event, which just makes editing the video easier. If you were not able to attend the last 2 webinars in this series, we're going to be sending you some links to those right about now. The first episode in this series concerned understanding the topic of dismantling white supremacy, and the second episode focused on the academy. And we have several more coming up, which are going to be really exciting about dismantling white supremacy in nonprofits, in healthcare, in emergency management, and more. And this series really grew out of DSJ's recent statements on inequities due to COVID-19 and police killings, which you should be able to see in the chat shortly. And also, we're collaborating with the journal Administrative Theory and Praxis to offer a companion journal series to this topic. And we're going to be sending you to the link to that call shortly. And we hope you really consider submitting a piece for review. So let's just have some quick opening comments here. So it's been roughly 2 months since the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis Police Department officers on May 25th, 2020. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, an officer knelt on George Floyd's neck for roughly 8 minutes. And protests began on May 26, 2020, and really continue to this day. These protests also come after other killings of Black persons by police, such as Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Elijah McClain, and many others. More and more people are increasingly protesting, marching, and demanding change so that all public services embody equitable services, and also so those services enshrine how Black lives matter, but also how Black lives are beautiful, Black lives are needed, Black lives are transformative, and more. And so given the spate of anti-Black racism, itself a manifestation of centuries of inequities and injustices, demands for accountability and reform abound, and discussions of defunding the police have gained international prominence. And these inequities stem to all aspects of the criminal legal system, such as in bail, court proceedings, sentencing, prison terms, and much more. And these inequities overlap with so many other inequities, whether in education, housing, healthcare, and more. The fact that we are in what Dr. Susan Gooden calls a double pandemic, COVID-19 racism, makes the inequities and injustices all the more acute and all the more necessary to address and solve. And so to help us explore these dynamics, and very importantly, to foster solutions to counter injustices and to foster fairness, we're proud to be joined today by 3 amazing panelists. We have Dr. Tyrone Dooley of the University of Illinois Springfield. We have Professor Natasha Robinson of Roosevelt University, and we have retired Chief Ivonne Roman, now with the Women Leadership Academy, as well as other organizations. And so we co-developed a few questions with the panelists that we're going to ask first, and these questions pertain to understanding the inequities and injustices they have seen or researched in the criminal legal system, as well as the actionable solutions they think could help address these inequities and injustices. And after addressing these questions, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A, and if you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the chat, and if you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question, just please indicate so in the chat, and we can do that. And Parisa Vincent, who's our major digital engagement coordinator, will be co-facilitating the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now so we can get to our first question, which I am going to copy and paste into the chat here, and then we'll just get going. 1 second. So the first question is this: what is an inequity or injustice you have seen or researched in the criminal legal system? And what are the causes and effects of these inequities and injustices? And for our panelists, just feel free to go in whatever order you'd like.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. First off, I want to go ahead and thank you, Sean, and also thank the American Society for Public Administration and this panel on democracy and social justice for actually sponsoring this. And I'll just kind of dive right in. I want to sort of preface this by saying, though, and you have to bear with me, I tend to kind of go around the barn before I actually get to the point, so please forgive me. But even this sort of the nature of what we're talking about today, and as far as what the section even entails in terms of democracy and social justice, really is a paradox that the founding fathers sort of attempted to address as it relates to the white population, not the non-white population that existed prior to the founding and at the founding of this country. And it is a paradox which we actually are dealing with in the 21st century relative to criminal justice reform and housing, and really to quite frankly with you, all aspects of American life as it relates to the non-white population and sort of Black and brown populations and that kind of thing. And so when we think about things that I guess I've engaged in from a research perspective, right now we're working on a research project that's looking at issues related to equity and racialized decision-making in housing. And so we're looking at a couple of different communities in Illinois, but quite frankly, some things that are happening in Illinois are happening all across the country in terms of concentrated poverty and concentrated Black and brown populations, right, existing really predominantly in poverty in pockets in the city, and what that actually entails, and what are the repercussions for that. So we've been looking at that, and that actually ties in, though, I think, clearly with issues related to policing, issues related to our society, and I want to explore those a little bit more, but I'll just stop there to give everyone else a chance to go ahead and speak.
So in my work, I got involved with inequities when I started realizing that an inordinate number of women were being dismissed from police academies. I didn't know if that issue was just in my agency, or if it was statewide, or if it was in the nation. So what I learned was that the number of women hasn't increased in over 25 years. It's right around 12%. And specifically in New Jersey, where I noticed the problem, 60 to 85% of the women that were starting police academies were being dismissed. And overwhelmingly, those women were predominantly Black, and then the remainder were brown. This has impacts on how we police, the people that get to police. It affects the leadership, because if you don't get them in through the front door, they're not going to funnel their way up through the chain of command. And what we've seen in the research is that increasing the number of women having an agency that's representative of their communities leads to better outcomes in those engagements. It leads to less lawsuits, it leads to less use of force, less citizen complaints. So there's an overwhelming body of research that shows that there's benefits to increasing their numbers, and yet it seems that no one is paying attention to the fact that we're not increasing their numbers, and that the few that do apply are being weeded out of the academy through procedures and policies that are unconstitutional, that they violate EEOC, that they violate case law. But because we have such a fractured law enforcement community, there's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies, you have the potential for 18,000 different policies, procedures, guidelines for hiring. So it makes it that much more difficult to address the disparities that we identified in the recruiting and retention of policing that has direct impacts on the type of services and the quality of services that communities receive.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you, ASPA, for having me, and to my panelists and to Sean, I appreciate the opportunity to respond and to answer the questions that have been posed. I come from the practitioner standpoint of having been involved in the criminal legal system for 20 years, almost 13 of those being as an assistant public defender, and then the remaining time being in the classroom. One inequity or injustice that I see, there are many, there are levels to this. I will say one that is not often talked about is barrier of language as it relates to the comprehension, the use, and the complete access of legal language to those who need it the most, particularly those who are either a witness to a crime, a defendant or the accused of the crime, or a witness, someone who has been the complainant or the victim and the defendant. I think that language has been used to further marginalize and disenfranchise persons who are involved in the criminal legal system. So I see that as an inequity, because if you use language as a weapon as opposed to a tool, then you are further dehumanizing those who already feel dehumanized because of the situations that they find themselves in. The causes and effects of those, as I said, is multifaceted. I would say the way in which discretion is wielded by a number of individuals that can be from legal professionals all the way to those who make the policies and procedures. If discretion becomes weaponized, then it does not become a tool. It becomes a bargaining chip. It becomes a use of force that can continue to oppress those that the system, which we'll talk about later, was already created to oppress. So I think that those are that's definitely a cause, and the effects are what you see today.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Before we get to our next question, I was just hoping to ask a follow-up question of all of you, which is based upon everything that you were just saying about your response. Kind of a vague question. How did we get here? How did we get to these inequities? How were they created? And this next question will really, after this, will address, how do we change this? What needs to change? So really, how do we get here?
So, at the founding, at the founding, if you think about criminal justice and what this notion of policing actually is, the police are enforcers of the social order, right? Now, that's a fairly innocuous statement, but ultimately what it means is, right, particularly when a society was created and constructed to promote whiteness, to benefit white male property owners, what that means is that enforcers of the social order, right, keepers of the social order, they are designed to go ahead and promote those interests at the exclusion of others. And in fact, sort of when you think about the justice system in terms of as it applies to the Black and brown population, there were sort of two different aspects of justice. And in fact, by the 18th century, when we think about penalties, only the most severe penalties in terms of burning, in terms of being pulled across on a racking, were reserved for African Americans and African American bodies to the exclusion of others. And so there is sort of this notion, and we can fast forward then into the civil rights movement in terms of police being used, right, to counter that movement. Again, any sort of threat to that paradigm, that social paradigm, is an issue. But ultimately, though, right, in terms of, and I agree that representation is one aspect of reforming policing. But and also agree that there are some things as it relates to procedures that needs to actually happen. But one of the things we actually have to confront is this notion of implicit racialized bias, right? In terms of what that actually means and what that deals with. And when we have frontline implementers, which have implicit bias as it relates to Black and brown bodies, the Black and brown community, until that particular aspect is addressed along with these other reforms that need to happen, then we're going to still find ourselves in the same situation that we're in.
My response to that would be, how do we find ourselves here? There are a lot of roads that lead to one outcome. I am a firm believer that when you want to follow what the laws and policies say, you look to a person's morals. So morals have been legalized in this country, and when you have that is when you start to create or rather expose a belief system. So when you think about some of the legal cases that have exposed what those of the inhabitants, what they believed, you can look to the Dred Scott decision, 1857, which you had the Chief Justice of the United States say that the Black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect. Blacks meaning Black man. It did not even talk about Black women. It did not talk about indigenous persons. It was a moral decision that was legalized and further allowed for the legal oppression of persons who were enslaved. Then you move on to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, where you have, again, the Supreme Court saying that separate but equal is constitutional. So that gives those who have racism in their minds and in their hearts another opportunity to continue to use the law to oppress persons who have already been oppressed. You have 1954 and 1955, Brown versus Board of Education, where you have, again, the United States Supreme Court saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional. But when the states look to the federal government for guidance or for leadance about how to, you know, how to make alive, to make come alive, what is it they're suggesting? The Supreme Court says, well, take your time. It's with all deliberate speed, which is very subjective. So how do we get here? We get here when you have the morals of persons that are then changed to or converted to legal statutes, legal precedents. When you have a situation, there's a book called God in the Ghetto, and it's by Dr. William Augustus Jones. And he posits in that book that when, or rather how a person sees God, whether it is, he argues a deity, I would argue where it is a collection of belief of ideals, that theology then frames your anthropology, how you see other people, and then it forms your sociology, which is how you treat other people. So you have people who were in power who, according to the founding fathers, they articulated what they believed was important to them, which is whiteness, which is privilege, which is oppression. And then that then set the order in which they saw other people, which then determined the format to treat other people. So now we have in the 21st century, the criminal justice system, which is just echoing and reverberating back all those, you know, years ago about there being a preference of power, of control, of disenfranchisement, and the ability for us now, we have an opportunity to continue to figure out how do we come into a system that is not broken, but it is already working. How do we use our collective gifts and our collective skills to try and dismantle, if not completely abolish the system, and then work to not be so focused on dismantling a system that we forget to build it back up.
May I just add one comment to this? One comment to that. I believe it was Reverend Sharpton that said that first you have protestation, then you have legislation, and you have reconciliation. But I do want to add that when we think about when you think about the political process, right? The political process and the output of that is legislation, right? And politics is the authoritative allocation of values and capital, and those outputs are what government chooses to do or not to do. But as public administrators and as frontline implementers, right? They have, even if there is a law on the books tomorrow that says there's not going to be any more chokeholds, we're not going to go ahead and shoot unarmed black men in the streets. The issue with this is there are laws that are being handed out right now as it relates to people having to go ahead and wear a mask, and there are sheriff's departments and there are police departments across the country that are saying no, we're not going to do that. So part of the response, I agree, is to have the legislation, but the other part though is to go ahead and impact those frontline implementers of, as it relates to policing, to act in a different way.
So as far as the historical context and the issues that I identified, when you speak to law enforcement officers, most of them are incredibly offended when you even mention the notion that policing can inherently be racist, right? They take it personal. You're calling me a racist, but they have to realize the history of how policing evolved, how it came about, and what the purpose was. So you mentioned the case of Dred Scott, right? It ruled that that property rights were supreme to human rights. It said that he was property, and who was supposed to enforce that decision, right? Law enforcement, police officers. You mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Separate but equal. So who enforces that? Law enforcement is the arm, right? It's in the name. They enforce these laws that were inherently racist and discriminatory. So now you create this system that is designed to enforce these laws that protect white male property owners. So who's actually doing this is white males. As court decisions went allowing more access to people of color into these institutions, then they designed these regulations and these protocols that weed out certain people, right? So in the 70s, it started with having a height requirement. And by requiring that most cops be 5'9", you eliminated most minorities and almost all women, because the average American woman is 5'4". And then when the courts in the 70s ruled that that was unconstitutional, that it discriminated against groups, then they switched from the height requirement to physical fitness. But for a lot of agencies, the way they've designed that program, it still eliminates large swaths of the communities. So it seems like it's all, different problems, but it still all boils down to maintaining that authority within white male structure. Even though they don't acknowledge that's how it was designed, that it's baked into the system, and it remains to this day an issue that we're still trying to correct.
I mean, I think these are all fantastic points, and thank you for bearing with me as I asked that follow-up question. I just loved the answer to the first question so much. So just so everyone knows, we had a few people who are just joining us. We're going through about 3 opening questions with our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. We already had a great question asked by Dr. Rajay Berry James, so of course she'll be going first. But our second question that we are going to ask about is this, and I'm going to post it in the chat here right now. What societal, legal, policy, and or administrative dimensions need to change to foster equity and justice in the criminal justice system, and why?
Well, okay. I'll be very brief. I'll try to be. I apologize for being a little long-winded sometimes.
Never apologize, Dr. Dooley. It's wonderful.
So, we did some research about a year ago looking at issues related to use of force policies. And so looked at the 100 largest law enforcement police departments around the country, and looked at their use of force policies. So we sort of did a deep dive in terms of that. So interestingly enough, when you run the analysis, of correlation analysis on this, and long story short, there was a relationship that existed between having more administrative paperwork, and I don't want to dive too deep into the weeds on this, but there has been more administrative paperwork if you draw your weapon or use your weapon on someone that's unarmed. If there was a civilian review board, right? There was a relationship in terms of associated with withdrawing their weaponing and using it in those types of situations. So there are, and this is really the focus that needs to happen. Yes, we need legislation. Yes, from a legal perspective, the notion of limited immunity that police officers have in certain situations need to be addressed. But also from an administrative perspective, there needs to be administrative consequences baked into the cake, and that's where the administrative state can play a role. And I'm coming at it from a PA perspective, from a public policy perspective. And yes, we need the legislation, but we also need to change the regulations that impact law enforcement, those frontline implementers, in a positive way, to go ahead and finally get a handle on really the assassination of Black men in this nation.
So I wrote an article that was published yesterday, actually, at the Police Foundation, about evaluating policies or strategies for potential harms. So we discussed how the systems were created. They were created to protect power holders and property rights. So moving forward, there would have to be an evaluation of what the outcomes are of what you're doing, and if there's any blowback effects, unintended consequences, any harms, and adjustments made from there. I'm an advocate for policing to use science to improve their outcomes. I work for the Center for Policing Equity, and we look at police data. the data alone is a treasure trove to identify disparities. If they wanted the answers, they could find them, but they have to take that deep dive and ask those tough questions. Where are the harms being caused, and what can we do to correct that?
From my perspective, being in court and working with different clients as well as different community organizations, I am coming from the legal perspective, which is off the top of my head, two things that need to change. First is us defining what is justice. We use the term criminal justice system, and to me, it is the equivalent of if I were to ask the panelists, tell me what you visualize when you think of the color red. And I assure you that there are going to be different shades of red. So I think we first need to figure out, when we say justice, what do we mean? And secondly, do we acknowledge the difference between criminal justice and a criminal justice system? That is, I think, the first perspective that we need to address. The second we need to address is as it relates to relationships or connections. When you have persons who are being prosecuted or arrested or even defended by people that they don't know, it causes a displacement, because there is no faith by most people in the criminal justice system. Now, there can be a myriad, that can be a whole different webinar panel as to why that exists. But I think some things that need to be able to be changed includes enables to foster equity and justice in the criminal justice system. It looks differently for different people. When Dr. Dooley was talking about accountability, the accountability to hold people responsible for their decisions means then how are we enforcing the accountability in areas of discretion? In the police, there is discretion on the street, where you have the police officers who are making in real-time moments the decision whether or not to arrest someone or whether to engage in those type of relationships where they say, you know what, this time is a warning, next time it is something else. So you have discretion at that part. Discretion in the courts is whether or not someone will be prosecuted for a particular crime or a lesser included offense. Is it a crime that needs to be able to go to a plea? Can it be negotiated prior to trial, or is it something where it can be resolved, by way of a trial? Discretion in corrections, where you have correctional officers who have discretion over the population that they supervise and that they I won't say work with, but that they are hired to look over or to look after. So when you're talking about equity, you are talking about issues of power, you're talking about issues of language, and in addition to what the panelists say about accountability, about making sure that policies are put into place so it's not just people are just talking for show, but that you are able to use data, that you are able to use science, and that you are able to put faces to the names and the numbers that we discuss so that those relationships can be strengthened.
I really love what Ms. Robinson was talking about, relative discretion. And I'm just going to add one little bit as it relates to discretion. The only other aspect of discretion I would also say, even when the call comes into, and this is where, again, we talk about rules and administration. When the call comes into the police station, the operator there will make the call either priority 1, 2, or 3. And that's discretion in terms of the response that you may get from the police on the front end. Sometimes small things can have huge repercussions.
Yeah, and to that I would respond when we're talking about the issue of discretion. If you look at the case of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was killed in Ohio, I would believe, the 911 operator, there was some information that she left out in her speaking to the police officers who arrived on the scene. So it's like a passive discretion, in that one thing, that one fact that she left out about it could be a child, which is what the caller said. That one piece reverberated into the death of a 12-year-old. And so that is just but one of, many examples that we all know where discretion is something that, yes, I'm not saying that discretion should be taken away, because in situations of charging, in situations of arrest, you need to be able to have that expansive field for people to match their expertise with their experience so that they can make an informed decision. But when it becomes weaponized, and when that discretion becomes almost as dangerous as a firearm or a taser or a billy club, then that's where you have a problem.
So I have some concerns about, the issue of discretion, because when it has been removed from police officers, has been in this broken windows, zero tolerance policing, where no matter who it is, they get locked up and they get a ticket, because it's about making mass arrests in this belief that it will drive down crime, where you address the low level offenses. And according to, this theory that really doesn't have a research basis for it, that is what causes crime to go down. When in actuality is just locking up as many people as you can. You cast out a wide net, and you hope that in that wide net where you lock up 100 people, that there's one shark in that net, right? And that was a program where they removed discretion from the police officers and ordered them to arrest everyone, but in specific hotspots, right? In areas that tend to have the highest crime, which also tend to be areas that are Black and brown.
Anyone like to follow up on that? Any follow-ups to that? Okay. So we did have a few other people join us, so we're just going through a few initial questions with our panelists, really just to get the conversation going, and then we already have some questions that are being asked through the chat, both privately and not. But just to get to this last question we prepared before we get to these excellent questions that are already coming in, it's this third one, and I'm posting it in the chat right here. So given everything we've talked about, we've began with trying to understand some inequities and injustices. We moved into what are some big things that need to change. And now one of the things we'd like to ask is, what is a specific promising reform strategy for the criminal legal system? What would it entail? And why do you think it would work to foster equity and justice?
I don't know if this would be under the heading of a promising reform strategy, but I would definitely say I have an issue with the phrase justice is blind. And the reason why I say it is because I need justice to see me. I need justice to acknowledge who I am, where I come from. I need justice to be able to acknowledge that notwithstanding whether or not I actually committed a crime, I need justice to be able to see each and every person that appears in front of a judge, who appears arrested by the police, who appears being represented by the defense attorney. I need to be able to be seen, because until I am seen, my voice, what I feel to be close to me, cannot be heard. It cannot be understood, because a lot of times I believe that people are just lumped into big amorphous groups where it's just, okay, well, the accused. When we're doing stats and data, it becomes, okay, well, this percentage is this and this percentage is that. And I think that in order for, if the system is to be not abolished but reformed, there needs to be an understanding about the seeing of the humanity, of seeing the persons who are coming in front. I can think of when I would be in bond court in Chicago, and how you would have family members sitting in the audience, and they would be waiting for hours upon hours for their loved ones to come in front of a judge, just for the judge to spend maybe 3 to 4 minutes on each and every person, with the understanding that you have maybe 200 more defendants, misdemeanors and felonies, who have yet to come in front of the judge. So I would say, to preface what I said earlier, I don't know if this is considered to be a reform strategy, but definitely the acknowledgement that justice is not blind. It needs to see, it needs to be able to perceive, It needs to be able to acknowledge that there is not one strategy fits all. That would be my perspective coming from my experience as a litigator.
So all these things are interconnected, right? And so when we think about the criminal justice system and the bias, the implicit bias that's there, that's racialized. We think about housing, and we think about public spaces and activities. So my answer is a complicated one for as it relates to solving it, right? So, well, I think that the use of the police to weaponize, the weaponization of the police against Black and brown bodies in public spaces needs to be addressed, right? So Black people are barbecuing, let's call the police. Black people are hanging out or going to their apartments, let's call the police. Black people are sitting at a Starbucks, let's call the police. Right, and we could keep going on and on and on as it relates to this. But the use of the police for these sort of minor levels of really social engagement in public spaces, right, needs to be addressed. There needs to be a reform from that perspective, which actually sort of ties into this notion of implicit bias. There are studies that have been done that, as it relates to neighborhoods, right, that as neighborhoods approach 25 to 30% non-white, white flight increases, right, out of that neighborhood. This is an output, right, of these sort of implicit notions of how white society views Black and brown bodies, Black and brown families, Black and brown communities. We think about the redlining practices that occurred in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and in some cases are still occurring now. The denial of Black and brown families, even when adjusted for income and credit rating, still Black and brown families are denied 60% mortgages, right, when compared to their white counterparts. So this is a complicated society that we're living in, which is used again to promote whiteness at the exclusion of everyone else. And so part of this is really sort of addressing the nature of implicit bias and racism and seeing that head on. And so a solution to that, if you can't change someone's heart, make it overly complicated for them as it relates to doing something so that they're going to give them pause. And so from that standpoint, more administrative regulation for policing to go ahead and right these past wrongs.
So I wanted to make two comments. The first to Dr. Robinson's point, where she talked about using statistics and data. If they're used inappropriately, right, they can be used to justify programs that are incredibly harmful, right? So sometimes I'll have police officers tell me, well, all the crime is happening in this area, and 98% of the suspects are Black males. So who do you expect me to stop? I'm like, I expect you to narrow it specifically on the individual described in the report, right? Because it isn't the whole community that was accused of that crime. It's a specific individual with a specific height and weight, at a specific time, at a specific location. So you can take aggregate data and use it to justify really heinous programs, right? That over-polices and over-criminalizes predominantly Black and brown communities. And then the other one, to Dr. Dooley's point about weaponizing the police, right? That requires recognizing bias in all the forms that it may occur, right? So we call it profiling by proxy, where an individual will pick up the phone and call the police on Black and brown people merely for existing in public places, right? For selling water, for barbecuing. Poor FedEx guy was delivering products. The lady didn't believe he was a FedEx guy, though he's in uniform and he's dragging his little cart, right? But that's going to require more training for the call takers, right? So it's even looking beyond the cops, but looking at the whole system within policing for them to ask more questions. What specifically is this individual doing that is criminal in nature that you want a police response? And holding people accountable for using the cops as weapons. I got into a Twitter debate recently because I said these people need to be arrested. If they're targeting or harassing individuals merely for being Black and brown, they should be charged with a bias crime. And this led to, you know, huge back and forth that I'm looking to make more things criminal, or I'm over criminalizing. No, that there was an intent to use police to intimidate people for doing absolutely nothing. There has to be consequences for that, or their behavior will not be modified. That's my point.
I think that's an excellent point, because now it's police become a calling card. Mm-hmm. And so you have this force, this department of people who are in people's minds, the beck and their call, mm-hmm. instead of doing what it is that they have been called and sworn to do.
Where is the service? That's sort of the thing, right? I mean, this notion of, I mean, I was raised actually to distrust the police, and because the police typically, when they came to your neighborhood, it wasn't a good thing for anybody. But I will say there is sort of this notion of protecting and serving, and so too often maybe there's a little bit of limited. Well, there wasn't any protection. So when we were robbed, our house was broken into, and there wasn't much protection there, and there sure wasn't much serving. So I think that's really sort of the issue. I think, just one last point, police should treat everyone like they would treat a young white woman, a young white girl. Everyone should be treated at that level, in my opinion.
Well, and I think it's a really good discussion too, and I just received a few private messages. I was thinking about saving them for later, but I think, you know, now is a great time to talk about them. So when we look at, for instance, let's just look at policing. We hear a lot of calls for, you know, defunding the police, or sometimes even disestablishing police, so forth. I mean, who do you suppose should really be properly handling these calls? I mean, is defunding the police an option, or is something else need to be discussed, or this in tandem with something else?
So I think we had a natural experiment on what that would look like in 2007 to 2010, when police agencies were laying off cops because of the budget crisis. And if those communities were satisfied with the level of service that they were receiving, then they answer their own question as to what they can and cannot defund. What did they decide at that point? The police didn't have to do. I do believe that police are used as jacks of all trades to horrible effect, right? They shouldn't be dealing with mental health. They're not specifically trained for that. They shouldn't be dealing with homelessness. They're not trained to be social service providers or to make referrals, right? But if you decide that you don't want the police to handle that, there has to be something in place to answer these very serious calls about very serious problems that are happening in our communities. We reached this mental health crisis because they pulled the plug on mental health hospitals. They said they were inhumane, but they didn't set up any safety net in its place to handle that. And then it was passed off to law enforcement to handle, right? So I believe that there are roles that the police shouldn't be playing, but we have to set up the mechanisms so that we don't leave communities in a more vulnerable position than they're in now, which is what happened with mental health when the Supreme Court decision decided that it was inhumane and that they were going to do away with mental health hospitals.
I really hate that term, defund the police. I'm sorry. I just want to say that I really hate that term, because it really does provide a lot of confusion for the general polity when we think about when you hear people saying defund the police. No one is advocating getting rid of law enforcement. But again, just to Ms. Roman's point, that they're advocating, right, police focusing on what they're supposed to be good at, right? And that is a law enforcement sort of notion, not some of these other social service sort of things.
To Chief Roman's point, and then to Dr. Dooley's point, the first, and I may have gotten this out of order, when police show up to assist me, although the outcome of police treating, you know, a young white woman may be more beneficial and profitable to the community, I want the police to see me showing up, you know, as me, as a 46-year-old Black woman. there are a couple things that I can never do. And one of the things that I can never do is turn into the young white woman. And when you're talking to people who have a, in some respects, many respects, a justifiable mistrust of the powers that be, they want the police to recognize them as them, and then let the outcomes, you know, be what they're made. As it relates to Chief Roman, when you were talking about, now I lost my train of thought. You were talking about, you know, I don't believe in keep talking when I don't remember what it is I was going to say. So I'm going to be quiet, but I know there is something powerful that you said that I wanted to address. And I'm gonna come back to
communities. No, criminalizing communities where you have a specific target, but they say, well, all the crime is happening there. Yeah, but not everyone in that community is committing the crime. I don't know if it was that.
It was not that, but you do bring up a good point. Whenever I would have a lot of police reports that I would review in preparation for trial, a lot of the police reports would start off with a young Black man age 18 to 30 wearing a white t-shirt with a tattoo. According to the village that I'm in, that's half the people that I see walking down the street. So when you have this all-encompassing net and you are bringing in people, that is something that is, you know, very problematic. I do remember what I was going to say when you were talking about the police and their interactions with mental health and homelessness and things of that nature. I can think of a case here in Chicago where you had Quintonio LeGrier, who was a young man who was having a mental health episode, and his family, like many families, called people who they thought would help, which were the police. And there are quite a few people that believe that when I get in trouble, I'm supposed to call the police and then let them, you know, handle that. But when you juxtapose that reality with the other reality of police officers either not feeling comfortable, not feeling trained, not feeling that they can handle those quote unquote social service calls, then it is a real-time decision where they have to make. Now in Latonio LeGrier's situation, the police ended up shooting not just him and killing him, but also killing the neighbor. They came out to see what was going on. And then the police officer went on to sue the city of Chicago and the police department, saying that the only reason why that happened is because he was not trained to do so. Now, although that may be an extreme case, it is a situation where you have two things happening. You have a group of people that believe, I need to call the police because if nothing else, they can help me. And then you have the police themselves in general, not specific, but in general, who are saying, while we are called to serve and protect, the asterisk behind that phrase, we're not all encompassed to respond to be able to do either because we may not feel comfortable doing that, because we may not be supported in our decisions of what we need to do. So I do agree with you. What I heard you say, what I think I heard you say was that it does not need to be all encompassing. It needs to be.
Police shouldn't be handling that call. And like you just said, you're out in Chicago, right? So I was watching a documentary, and Cook County is the largest provider of mental health services in the state. Yep. How is it that you have to get locked up in order to get mental health services? That's outrageous, right? I mean, that is appalling. That in itself should show why something like that could happen, right? You shouldn't be relying on the police in order to get mental health services. It's outrageous.
Yeah.
I also say one more thing for folks that are looking at this, who have dialed in, and thank you for coming in and watching. I want to say this very briefly. You know, we're not talking about every police force. We're not talking about all law enforcement. My grandfather was on the police force and served for 20 years in Stuttgart, Arkansas. So I am sympathetic to what happens for people when they take up that cause. But I do, and I want to say that also, and the research bears this out, that roughly 98% of all interactions with law enforcement and the public, right, do not result in death. So, and there also is a continuum of force that law enforcement utilizes. But here's the caveat: when the use of force results in death, right, as a Black and brown person, you are 3 times more likely to be the one that died.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really, really great discussion. And I'd like to, we're opening up to audience Q&A right now. This was a fantastic discussion to lay some groundwork. I'd like to open it up to Dr. Rajay Berry James, who has a question to really kind of bring all these different pieces together. So Dr. Berry James, please.
Thank you so much for taking my question. I have really enjoyed this panel. It may have been one of my favorite discussions this summer so far. So I'm going to get right to the point. My question was, given our current circumstances and situations, what is the action agenda for scholars and practitioners who are committed to social change? So in other words, what is the work that we need to do in order to activate the change that we seek? Who is it that we need to encourage to join us? When do we need to engage with others? How do we empower others to advance social justice? There's quite a bit of work to do, and I'm really focused on that action agenda to break down barriers, to find solutions, to work towards social justice. Could you give us some ideas about, the way to do it, how to get started, who to engage with? I mean, what in the world are we to do given our current circumstances situation?
So for me, I'm an executive member of the American Society for Evidence-Based Policing and also the Police Foundation. And I work for the Center for Policing Equity, where we use science, right? I think that there has to be a partnership between practitioners and researchers, but a true partnership, right? Where we're together, they identify the research agenda and that there's trust there, that the practitioners are giving access to their data and that the researcher isn't going to abuse that relationship, right? So that way we can learn what works, what doesn't, and that programs are evaluated. We spend millions and millions of dollars and we don't know what the outcomes are to those programs at the end, or we don't want them to come out because they weren't good. But there are lessons to even be learned if something doesn't work. We know we should either modify it or reject it, but too often the results of that doesn't come out. So other agencies may be doing the exact same program that had poor outcomes in another city. So we have to create those partnerships and then make sure that that knowledge gets out, right? That it's not hidden behind paywalls where you have to have, some relationship in academia in order to access it. Make sure that that research trickles down to the people who can most benefit from it, which is the practitioners.
Well, also, I'd say you're in the right place, right? So ASPA and the section on democracy and social equity is a good place to be. There are a number of researchers in PA that are working in this particular area. Brandy Blassett is actually on this call. Obviously, Sean McAllis, who is the moderator here, and a number of others. And so I can tell you though that ASPA, roughly about 20 years ago, it's one of the pillars of our discipline. We've incorporated social equity as a pillar in terms of a foundation of what public administrators and public administration should be about, along with efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. And so my sort of pat answer, and it's probably not a great one, is that you're right where you need to be, right here at this panel. And there's a lot of research and a lot of stuff out there that you could actually utilize and access.
So my response would be to let your outcome determine your agenda. Let your outcome determine your agenda, meaning whatever you want your intended outcome to be, that then sets the agenda. I would suggest looking at the ways of intersectionality between criminal justice and public policy, between criminal justice and education, criminal justice and medicine, whatever your current or intended intersectionalities to be, because I think that in order to engage in social justice, we need to expand our understanding and definition of what social justice is and what it is not. I would also recommend, if you are in the area of academia, to engage in experiential learning for students, where they are able, as Chief Roman has indicated, where you are engaging in those allyships, where you are working with committees and organizations and activists that already have feet to the ground, so that you don't have to build, you know, the wheel from the ground up. I would also suggest watching appointments and elections. There are a lot of times where you may have judges who are elected as well as who are appointed, in addition to prosecutors. For example, for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, that is an elected position. So you have opportunities to be able to see, for the head prosecutor, whether they are elected or appointed, what is their position? What is their beliefs? What has been their record as it relates to social justice? Same thing for police. You have in Chicago, although that person, the superintendent, was appointed by the mayor, you're still able to do some due diligence to see, what does this person stand for? What is their record of arrests or convictions or reduction in crime from the city from which they came? I would also say, understand that we all have levels of influence. It may be as far as 1 million people. It may be as close to just grandma or nana or granddad. So using your voice in conversation, as well as understanding your platform, is wherever you are. So it can be in a arena. It could be on social media. It could be in a classroom. It could be in an article. It could be on a blog. Trying to make sure that you understand that as you continue to speak truth to power, you understand what the truth is, how you can gain that power, and then how you can share it with others. Some other things would be, as you see in the background of Dr. Dooley, there are some great resources, some great books that are able to talk about the research, the data, as Chief Roman has talked about. You have us. You have just a myriad of ways. Letter writing still works. Protesting still works. But again, the outcome determines your agenda. And then once you decide what that agenda is, I would suggest make it in such a way where people feel that they are invested in it. And if you are working in a particular community, it is not about what you think the community needs, but rather hear from the community about what they need, so that you're able to meet with them, partner with them, and then try to provide it with them.
I think this is such a fantastic discussion. One of the things I'm trying to post here in the chat is just a reminder to everyone that, and we can also send this to panelists as well, but we also have a call for papers that is precisely about all of these things that we're talking about. And if you'd like to contribute to this series, we hope you go ahead and click on that link about dismantling white supremacy in public service organizations and society. And just to build on what Dr. Barry James asked, we do have a question from Dr. Kathleen Yang Clayton, who was actually the first panelist on our Dismantling White Supremacy series, who has a question about HR. So Dr. Yang Clayton, you should be off mute.
Oh yeah, sure, thank you. And wow, thank you to the panelists. I'm joining these webinars, and these are like some of the best graduate seminars I've ever listened. I wish my graduate seminars had been this interesting. So thank you so much. So I guess I'm curious about the internal processes within police departments. I want to return back to this question of discretion, and sort of what it means to think about human resources, operations, budgeting within a police department. And I guess the question I had was, how would you operationalize a definition or a working understanding of discretion that would actually reward racial equity driven decision making or discretion? How, Because I'm assuming that one of the reasons why we get the wrong kind of discretion, that weaponized discretion that Ms. Robinson is talking about, is because some of those internal processes are giving a very strong signal to frontline staff and supervisors that there's a certain way that discretion should fall. So have you encountered models or projects where those standard operating procedures have really been rewired or just dismantled, and then something new has been brought in, and has it stuck? Thank you.
So again, some people think that discretion should be eliminated, so then that regardless who gets stopped, you have the same outcomes, right? But I think discretion shouldn't be removed because you have mitigating or extenuating circumstances, right? And the shoe does, you don't have one treatment for all ailments. So I was having a conversation with Barry Friedman. He's over at NYU. He believes that discretion should be eliminated. But on the flip side, I described the outcomes that you can have when discretion is eliminated. It turns into a zero tolerance policy that really is horrible for relationships, horrible consequences for communities, and usually is driven by collars for dollars, dollars for collars, where you're trying to make profits off of giving tickets and summonses. So now if someone wants to ensure that there isn't disparities in how discretion is being used, then you would have to start a program where you evaluate your own data, right? And to see if the outcomes are the same regardless of where in the city or where the population is. So I work with the Center for Policing Equity, and we try to identify disparities. And so a lot of times we'll have cities that say, well, we'll have disparities in this area because you have a lot of motorists that drive through that are Black and brown from surrounding communities. But then you have to look at data, and does this data show that Black and brown people are worse drivers than your white communities? And if it doesn't pan out, then the data is telling you a story. There should be no reason why Black and brown people are stopped at higher rates, even if they are driving through, if the data doesn't show that they have more accidents or they have more moving violations, that's something that's not related to race. So again, I go back to looking at the data to try to identify disparities if you're trying to monitor if discretion is leading to a worse or better outcomes based on race.
I think Chief Roman makes a great point. And so, you know, I think you have two different levels of discretion though too that we're looking at, right? You're looking at sort of administrative level discretion, which she's talking about, which should totally be data driven from that perspective. I think you've got frontline implementer discretion as well, and that can either be incentivized or sanctioned, right? So and from a sanction perspective, again, making it, if you draw your weapon, you utilize force, right? Having a civilian review board, right, involved, right, in the after effects or the after action in terms of what happens could make an impact on that individualized notion of whether or not I should go ahead and utilize my weapon, right? Also, you could perhaps provide incentives for officers to go ahead and behave in a manner in which they should properly behave in. So it's either sanction or incentive, but also again that it should all be data driven. I'm completely with you there from an administrative perspective, but also from a frontline implementer perspective as well.
And we have a sort of a follow-up question regarding this. So I'd like to invite Frank Plunkett to speak. So Frank, I believe you should now be off mute.
Frank?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you very much. I appreciate being able to ask a question. First, I want to follow up real quick on the discretion thing. As a police officer, having been a police officer for 25 years myself in New Jersey, retired 10 years ago, I think the issue of taking away discretion completely, to me, would not work out too well, because if I had to take an enforcement action against every single person that I encountered, well, of course, our courts are already clogged. Imagine what it would be like. The question follows up on Dr. Dooley's comments about weaponization and the citizenry weaponizing the police. I had my own experience years ago in my career where our dispatcher was out sick. I had to sit on a desk. Some white woman calls in at 4 o'clock in the morning, looked out her window and saw a black man walking down the sidewalk. And of course, what does she do? She calls the police. Well, there's a black man walking down my sidewalk. And of course, I'm a thinking guy. My question to her is, okay, what's he doing? He's walking down the sidewalk. He's a black man. Well, so what? Well, and it goes on and on and on until her husband gets on the phone and starts yelling and screaming at me that I need to send a cop out there because there's a black man walking through the streets. Like, okay, you want me to send a cop out there to harass this guy who's walking down the street at 4 o'clock in the morning? Yes. End of the story is, officer goes out there, talks to the gentleman, businessman from New York, does his constitutional walk through the neighborhood before he catches the bus up to New York City at 6. Crazy stuff. So my question is, there's a lot of talk about reforming the police, but societally, how do we change the people who are actually calling the cops at 4 o'clock in the morning because there's a black guy, or calling the cops claiming they're being threatened by the man who asked the woman to put her dog on a leash? That is an even bigger question, because how the police react to things oftentimes is based upon what the citizenry asks for. And, sometimes that's bent all by itself. Thank you.
So Frank, we follow each other on Twitter. So I think you saw that little Twitter feud of mine. But it was specifically about that. If you're weaponizing the police, right? And if someone calls the police for someone who's doing absolutely nothing wrong, right? I think if you have 1 or 2 examples that go viral of someone getting charged for abusing police services, that'll curtail that, right? Make an example of someone. And people may cringe when I say that, just like I got a lot of pushback on Twitter when I said it. But you have people that unless there's something mentally deficient with them, right? They know the difference between right and wrong. They know that someone walking down the street isn't suspicious merely because they're walking down the street. I think that some states have considered passing legislation that would make it illegal to harass individuals by calling the police on them. And the standard of proof may be high, right? Proving that this person had an ill intent to harass. But I think a few prosecutions would make people think twice before they call the police on someone who was engaged in innocuous activities.
Again, I think racialized bias is what we're talking about here. Implicit bias is what we're addressing. So what you're asking is how do you sort of change someone's subconscious bias against a whole group or segment of the population? And that's extraordinarily difficult. Number one, to address your question directly, I agree with the directors. There probably should be some sort of sanction, some sort of fine, some sort of something for going ahead and calling the police, in that particular perspective. But the broader sort of point in what you're saying is, which is also reflected, right? Because our institutions are a reflection ultimately of our values. I teach an organizational dynamics course, which talks about these same things, right? So the racial bias that you get in some of these cases and examples of the assassination of black men by law enforcement, right? It came from somewhere. It came from the community. These aren't just a few sort of bad apples. This is a reflection of the racist society that we live in. And so, yes, to address your question, sanction those folks some kind of way, a fine or whatever, or community service, or jail for 10 days, whatever. But addressing sort of what's in their heart, right? That's a broader question that's going to take us, really far more than the time we have left to go ahead and address.
There is a minister by the name of Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is a minister of the United Church of Christ Conference. She is over the justice ministries. And one quote that she says, and I pulled it up to make sure I didn't misquote her. It says, quote, "It is impossible to be unarmed when my blackness is the weapon you fear," end quote. So when you are talking about the changing of hearts. I'll address that first. We're dealing with an issue of Afrophobia, which is where there are people who have a distinct and extreme hatred for all things Black. And so that hatred looks differently. And some people may not say, I love freaking Black people. I mean, I just watched Do the Right Thing the other day. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when people feel comfortable enough to use their fear in opposition to another race or another group of people. This is more than just stereotypes. This is archetypes where there has been entrenched in this history of our country a fear for Blacks and especially a fear for Black men, which is why I'm presuming the woman felt comfortable enough not to just have her husband address the Black man, but to have the police come in because his crime was for nothing other than the color of his skin. So that is an issue of the heart, which is harder to change and harder to address if you do not have people who feel that there's anything wrong to address in the first place. Now, in terms of accountability, I agree with my panelists, is that when you start attaching consequences for these actions and reactions, then hopefully you will see the tide change. There is no reason why this woman should call and say this man is walking down the street for any other reason than him just walking down the street at 4 o'clock in the morning, and now the police have to be involved. If the police officer did not have the training or the backing of you to be able to say that this is completely ridiculous, then that could have ended up being another George Floyd. That could have ended up being another Tamir Rice. That could have been another Eric Garner, but for his ability to see that this was foolishness. So when we're talking about changing the hearts and the minds, I said earlier in the beginning that people's morals and beliefs then drive the laws. We need to be able to start putting in place and holding people accountable for them saying, like the woman in New York, oh, it's a Black man assaulted me. That is a crime. There is no way around that. That is something that she needs to be prosecuted by, and she needs to be sued. To be quite honest, sued civilly, because that is engaging in defamation. And that is not something that needs to be thrown under the rug or smoothed down or explained away. She was just scared. If you look at the number of cases, particularly in the last 5 years or so, you have an increasing number of people who feel that they can use the police to do what they want to do, which is to further be an extension or an arm of their racist beliefs. And that cannot be tolerated. Period, point blank.
This is a fantastic discussion. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pooja Paswan. One moment. Dr. Paswan, I believe you should be off mute now.
Thank you. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, I think your call broke up just slightly. Could you start over?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Just a comment. First of all, it's an excellent panel. I have to compliment DSJ for organizing this panel and the series of panels that have been organized so far. Just one comment. In India, where caste discrimination is very predominant, it's a common practice for many people who belong to the so-called lower category or lower caste to hide their family names so that they might feel included. But this time during the government census, what the government did was ask people to disclose their caste and their subcaste so that the citizen could be profiled. And this has led to a lot of insecurity because it is quite brutal because, that the upper caste would often treat people from certain category as untouchables. And the practice of untouchability even exists today in the villages. I just wanted to bring that up in this session, that how much I correlate to both these discriminations being practiced in India and in the US.
Thanks for making that point, right? That discrimination happens across the globe. The difference is that in India, you're able, some people are able to hide their names to not reveal their caste, right? But Black and brown people can't hide their skin color, right? So the minute they come out, you know, barbecuing, selling water, making deliveries, right? They can't escape the color of their skin.
And that leads into a question from Deborah. So one second, we just find your name in the list. So Deborah, I believe you should be off mute now, I think.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, just fine, thank you.
Thank you everyone for such a great discussion. I'm so glad that I registered for this. And I also follow you, Chief Roman, on Twitter, and Frank and a few other people here. So it's like a gathering.
Oh yeah, Deborah, I remember you. My Twitter friends.
Yes. And evidence-based police conference, virtual Zoom cocktail hour friends.
Yeah, that's right.
I just wanted to mention that I work with a lot of, you know, average size agencies around the country, and I've become much more in tune to so many of these issues from listening to so many people like our panelists here. And it's occurred to me that I think in the average city agencies around the country, I think some of them just don't know what else to do besides arrest. They just don't, I don't know, there's perhaps not enough leadership training, or there's not enough opportunities for them to see that many of the popular strategies right now in no way dictate arrest, but they don't know of other options, and they don't know how to perhaps address crime. And I'm just wondering your opinions on kind of that perspective.
When I first became a police officer in 1995, I arrested someone for 3 vials of cocaine. It was my first arrest. And I almost got laughed out of the precinct, right? Because that was, in 1995 in my agency, it was unheard of to lock someone up for like simple possession, right? It was embarrassing. And then came in this whole broken windows ideology where you lock people up for minor offenses and supposedly, you know, crime goes down. And the stigma was removed from locking up people for low-level offenses. And in tandem with broken windows came CompStat, where commanders were held accountable based on arrests, stops, and summonses. And so if a commander had a homicide in his district, they wanted to know how many arrests he had in that area, how many stops he had in those areas, even if those arrests or stops had nothing to do with the underlying homicide. And so commanders became accustomed to, if I have mass arrests, then I will be okay when I go to CompStat. They'll see that I'm being productive, right? But productivity doesn't make effectiveness, right? Doesn't mean that you're being effective. And so many commanders became used to, I'm going to be evaluated based on the 7-day, the 28th day in the year, based on my productivity, that the answer to everything became arrests, even if those arrests had nothing to do with the violence that was happening. And we have to get away from the bastardization of statistics, because it's just numbers, right? It means nothing. There's no meaning behind them.
Right.
By full discretion and transparency, I have not ever been a police officer. So I stand in awe and honor of Chief Roman, because that is not my lane. I will say that from the litigator standpoint, the times where I have not seen an arrest are those situations where police officers formed relationships and connections with the people with whom they were in community. So where well, in my generation, we had the beat cops, okay? We had those that walked the streets, those that knew everyone by name. They knew what time you got out of school. They knew when someone was out of town. They knew, okay, I'm gonna say this to you once, and if I have to say it again, I'm gonna bring you home. So that, at that time, was a different paradigm where you had connection as opposed to correction. So in response to just arrest being the only thing that some officers know, I think that comes down to, you know, the internalized understanding of what it means to be a police officer, as well as it be matched with what is being modeled in the actual police precincts and departments. So if you have a police officer that does want to get to know the community in which she or he is assigned, then that may help decrease some of the arrests, because you have those personal connections as opposed to just people who fall within a big net of possible suspects.
I grew up in a small southern town in Arkansas in the 70s. So, to be honest with you, this notion of community policing that Professor Robinson is speaking to is fascinating to me, because that wasn't our experience. We didn't have police officers. My grandfather was a police officer for a while, but we didn't have police officers that regularly went through the community. Again, this community was segregated, as most of our communities in this country still are. So there are Black and brown neighborhoods in most racialized, segregated communities in most cities in the United States. So we didn't have that, and so this notion of collaboration, it would be great. I concur with her. I think collaboration and de-escalation are really two of the key sort of criteria to go ahead and move this forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. So we have about 8-9 minutes left. I'd like to turn it over to DSJ's Digital Engagement Coordinator, Parisa Vincent, who has a question that I think is a very nice follow-up on the ones we've been asking. So Parisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you to our fabulous panelists and to our wonderful audience members. It's been a wonderful discussion. So I'd like to just follow up on a previous question, and it's around action steps, or what needs to happen to really propel this change that we're seeking. So who is missing from this conversation about reform that needs to be involved? Or if they are involved but not currently listened to, how can we ensure those voices are centered and are heard? Thank you very much.
Great questions.
That's a great question. I would say first, the youth. I would say young people. I think that there needs to be more of an intention in allowing young people to be familiar with the criminal legal system, and not just when or if they become a part of it. I think that there needs to be intentional meetings with young people so that they are able, first, not to be afraid of anyone within the criminal justice system or be fearful with someone from the criminal justice system as soon as they meet them. I believe that what they have to say is powerful, and it is influential, and it is impactful if we sit down and provide the opportunity, not just for them to engage in discourse, but for also them to express it in the ways that we may not express it, but we are open to listening to. I think who also needs to be a part of the conversation would be those who have been arrested, those who have been involved as in the criminal justice system, from the perspective of what is the fear and what are the boundaries and what are the barriers that are in place. What do they feel when they are arrested? What do they feel when someone says, you know what, you can win this case with probation, but probation doesn't address the societal realities that they have to go through, such as I have to find a babysitter every time I come to court. I have to try and get my GED. I can't take off work anymore. So I think that their input is important. I think lastly, those who need to be involved would be legislators. Legislators who are the women and the men who create these laws. And I will include in that policymakers as well. But those that make the laws, so that we are able to understand what is the language that needs to be used. What are the consequences and why is this language being used? And to understand how to be more responsive. I mean, how we're usually responsive to it, but how we need to be more proactive in the creating of these bills turning into laws. Because sometimes the intention may be to address a particular criminal or prescribed issue or activity, but the impact is a negative one, and it's a disproportionately negative.
And there needs to be a framework also for these different groups to go ahead and engage consistently. I mean, I think too often it's a sort of reactionary sort of thing where there is some engagement in response to something, and maybe that's proactive for a while, but then the enthusiasm tends to lag, and then people go back to their own silos. And so I think law enforcement also needs to be a part of this as well. So input from those, but again, that framework, I think it's extraordinarily important as well.
So what I have concerns about is the cause now, right, for defunding the police, right? And even police leaders are in agreement that there's a lot of responsibilities that police take on that they're not well suited for, right? But you have this rush to make these cuts without proper planning to ensure that first to identify who you're going to pass these responsibilities off to, and then two, ensuring that they're set up to be able to handle them appropriately. My fear is that in this rush to appease demands to reform police, it's not being well thought out, and it's going to lead to poorer consequences than we have now, where there's still not a safety net put in place to deal with the most vulnerable people that we're discussing, right? These social service type jobs are the most vulnerable people in our communities, but we're not properly planning how this passing off of these responsibilities is going to occur, and how they're going to be staffed and how they're going to be funded in the long term. So that's my concern right now.
When it comes to putting meat on the bone in terms of different action steps, all the panelists have listed things that we can do. It can be as simple as going to, if you live in Chicago, CAPS meetings, where you are having conversations with the police officers about what is going on in the community. It could be as simple as making an appointment with elected officials. So in Chicago, it could be alderpersons. In the state, it could be state reps. It could be looking to see what are pending bills and what are pending legislation, and then contacting those elected officials to weigh in on what your positions could be. In classes, in schools, it could be looking at the news and trying to determine what are some things that are in the public's eye right now, and how can we advocate for or against. So when talking about young people, trying to let them know that there are different ways of registering your concern and your voice, and then empowering them with that. So, and definitely with ASPA, that is definitely a wonderful platform to be able to have, as Dr. Dooley says, these sustained and these continuing conversations, so that these conversations are not in response to something always happening, but being proactive and making sure that we are ahead of the curve, so we can implement what Chief Roman has been saying about trying to have conversation about what do we mean when we say this, and what are the outcomes for this, and what is the data, what is the science, what are the relationships that can make sure that whatever choices we have, they're not just choices on the fly, but they are to be sustained for time to come.
And just to ask our panelists really quickly, we do have one other question to ask. Would it be okay to ask just this one question? We'll stop there.
Sure.
Okay, good. It's a question about education. It always comes up, but I just like to contextualize this by saying that when we ask this question, we recognize that we're really all teachers, whether professors in classes or trainers in agencies or parents or friends. I mean, we're always teachers because we communicate values and we contribute our voice and our experience to shape numerous systems. But I like to focus on higher ed as kind of our last question. We think about MPA degrees and any sort of degree in which a future public servant might get. What do we need to do to change teaching in higher education to teach these values of equity, diversity, and inclusion so that we can improve public services, especially the criminal justice, the criminal legal system?
It needs, okay, it needs to be throughout the curriculum, right? It needs to be a requirement, just as when someone takes freshman comp, there are 2 semesters typically required for that. Sometimes there are 3 semesters required for a foreign language. A class on social equity and inclusion and marginalized populations and the history of this nation and this notion of promoting whiteness and the impact on marginalized populations needs to happen throughout the curriculum every year. I think so. So as educators in higher education, every semester there should be a course required for every graduate to take at any institution across the country.
So I agree with Dr. Dooley in that it shouldn't be one class and then you check it off. Okay, we covered that, right? They've been taught that. Kind of like community policing. It would piss me off when an agency would say, oh yeah, we do community policing. It's those 4 cops over there. Like, no, community policing should be a theory that permeates from the top on down and everyone engages in community policing. So we have to stop thinking of it as a class and think of it as a theory that's embedded into everything that you're teaching.
To build upon what Dr. Dooley and Chief Roman has said, it definitely has to be more than just hit it and quit it. Well, we just mentioning it for the point of mentioning it. I would say definitely expanding and deepening the curriculum in terms of it being course that is adopted by the university and the department, and expanding the materials that are presented to the students. So it shouldn't just be waiting for February to say, okay, now we're going to have all of our Black academicians and writers to come, and now we're going to have this month of March of all women. No, it needs to be intentionally built from the beginning. So you are bringing the margins, as Bell Hooks says, you're bringing the margins to the center. You are making sure that the curriculum that is being taught is intentional and is inspirational. I would also add making sure that the experience is experiential, trying to make sure that if you are talking about social justice, what does that look like? Looking to see what are different and existing organizations with which your classes or your courses can partner with, so that students aren't just talking the talk, but they're walking the walk, partnering with police, partnering with judges and lawyers, partnering with correctional facilities, partnering with those who are being reintroduced to the communities after they have served some time in custody or time in corrections. I think putting flesh on these theories is what can help deepen the learning experience and expand it for our students on the higher educational level.
And I'd also like to give a particular shout out to Dr. Brandy Blessett. Not only is she on the board of DSJ, but she is really taking the lead in crafting a social justice focused MPA at the University of Cincinnati. I just want to let people know that, and there's also some great moves that are happening to really make sure that these values are spread throughout the curriculum. But with that, I mean, we always end up over time because there's such great discussions. But I really want to thank you, Dr. Dooley, Professor Robinson, Chief Roman. I mean, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended and for the wonderful questions and comments. We're also getting word on social media about how powerful this panel was, so we hope you get a chance to check it out. Please keep an eye out for the recording, and we are going to review the recording with our panelists before releasing. And just as a final entreaty, I mean, let's just all remember that it is our duty. It's our duty to foster equitable and just services for all and to dismantle this racism and white supremacy and patriarchy of public service institutions, to understand, counter, dismantle injustices at all levels, and to build new systems that lead to justice for all. So thank you again, Dr. Dooley, Professor Robinson, Chief Roman, all of our wonderful attendees and the questions. Thank you for attending today, and we hope you attend our future webinars. And have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.